So, I set one of my classes this essay the other day, discussed the significance of Candied in Of Mice and Men, and I thought it would be quite useful if I could have a go at it and show you what I would have written in the time. So I just gave myself 45 minutes, the same as them, and I talk through kind of what I was writing and why I was writing it the way I was. So let's have a look. Discuss the significance of Candied in Of Mice and Men. I've put this. When we first meet Candied in the novel, he's described as a stoop-shouldered old man. Perhaps Steinbeck is emphasising that he's been weighed down and almost crushed by hard physical work and the pressures and fears of old age as he nears the end of his working life. I'm starting off by trying to bring in a quote right from the outset about the stoop-shouldered, but I'm trying to look at that not just in a literal level in terms of what he looks like, but what could Steinbeck be suggesting about Candied through that reference. And I'm trying to bring it back to something about 1930s America, because if you're doing the Edexcel IGCSE, that's going to count for a significant portion of your marks, trying to bring whatever you're saying round to talking about the context. So I put, in 1930s America, old people like Candied had very little financial security. In the midst of the economic depression of the 30s, following the Wall Street crash of 1929, an old agricultural migrant worker like Candied would have been desperately clinging on to employment. So I'm trying to look at Candied not just as, certainly not as a real person, and not just as a character in the novel, but I'm trying to say, right, what does he represent? Well, he represents older people, older migrant workers at the time. In fact, later in the novel, he says, just as soon as I can't swamp out no bunkhouses, they'll put me on the canny. Steinbeck also uses Candied's stump or stick-like wrist to emphasise his vulnerability and powerlessness. So this is probably the central image of Candied that you need to make sure that you're writing about, isn't it? About his stump-like wrist and how that symbolises his powerlessness. So I'm trying to bring that in quite early on. On a literal level, he's lost his hand in an accident involving machinery, perhaps highlighting the poor levels of health and safety on ranches in the US in the 1930s. But symbolically, Steinbeck often uses hands to represent power. Lenny's paw, for instance, represents his immense physical power. So Candied's stump steers us to position him as one of the weaker members of the ranch. So I'm looking at how Steinbeck is using the stump as a symbol. Okay, and you do need to look at how Steinbeck presents these characters in this way. Try to not just tell the story. Okay, Steinbeck called the ranch a microcosm of 1930s America, and in this respect, that just means like a little mini version, something small representing something larger. And in this respect, Candied represents the plight of old people who often found themselves in a more vulnerable position financially. So I kind of feel as if I've used 3 or 4 quotes in my opening paragraph. I'm touching on context, I'm talking about symbolism, and I've introduced Candied, I think, quite well as a character in terms of, certainly in terms of him being one of the weaker, the least powerful people on the ranch. I'm going to start then with my next paragraph. I'm kind of thinking, well, let's look at when we first meet Candied. And this, of course, is in chapter 2, when George and Lenny arrive at the ranch, and the first person that they meet is Candied. And there's a lot of conversation between Candied and George and Lenny in chapter 2. And it's easy to overlook Candied here because he's largely talking about other people. So he's talking about Curly and the boss and Curly's wife and Crooks as well. So he talks about several people. It's easy to overlook that, but actually that's one of the things that's quite significant here. When George and Lenny first arrive, Steinbeck uses Candied as a tool to introduce other characters to us. He describes the boss, Curly, and Curly's wife, amongst others, to George and Lenny. His descriptions of these characters therefore influence our perception of them. So can you see what I'm trying to say there? I'm trying to say that how Candied describes these characters influences the way that we as readers see them. Okay, so it's to do with how Steinbeck is using Candy as a narrative tool to twist and influence and steer us as readers in terms of how we're responding to the other characters here. He describes Curly's wife as a tart, for instance, and suggests that engaging with her could be dangerous for George and Lenny. When we first encounter her, therefore, we have an impression of her as potentially sexually promiscuous and likely to cause conflict. So we get quite a one-sided, quite negative portrayal of Curly's wife from Candy. His later description of her when he stands over her dead body in chapter 5 is even more striking. He says, "You goddamn tramp, you done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody knowed you'd messed things up. You wasn't no good, you ain't no good now, you lousy tart." At this point, he's mourning the death of the dream, as he recognises that he will now not be able to buy a house with George and Lenny. And in some respects, we could see him as a mouthpiece for us as readers. He kind of says what we want to say, doesn't he? In that we also feel a sense of loss and disappointment at this stage, don't we? And perhaps we blame Curly's wife for engaging with Lenny in the barn. Okay. On the other hand, his willingness to blame Curly's wife for her own death is also notable here, isn't it? Yeah, so here she is, a woman who's just lost her life, lying on the floor. Who does he blame? He blames her. She is a female victim of male violence. Admittedly, Lenny did not act out of malice, but she is nevertheless a victim and surely does not deserve to be blamed. Candy's misogynistic attitude as he labels and blames Curly's wife throughout is one means by which Steinbeck reveals the prevalence of such attitudes in 1930s America. Misogynistic means very negative towards women, displaying a kind of an attitude of hate and sexism towards women. His attitude towards crooks is also significant. So we've looked at how Candy talks about and talks to Curly's wife, but we could also look at how he presents crooks as another interesting character on the ranch, because of course he's black. And so in terms of how Steinbeck might be exploring sexism and racism in 1930s America, Candy's representation of these characters is quite significant. It's almost like Steinbeck again. I'm just trying to talk about how Steinbeck uses Candy in this respect. So I put this: his attitude towards crooks is also significant. Although he appears to be on cordial terms with crooks when they talk in chapter 4 and calls him a nice fella when he first mentions him in chapter 2, he also repeatedly uses a derogatory racial slur to refer to him. This reveals a lot about the entrenched racism of 1930s America, in that even a sympathetic character like Candy, who appears to respect crooks, does not hesitate to use language which contributes to his oppression. Yeah, he doesn't think at all about the impact of constantly referring to crooks using derogatory racial slurs. Okay, Slim contrasts to Candy in this respect by referring to crooks using his name. I don't know if you've noticed, but when Slim talks to crooks, he actually just says, "Hello, crooks. Yeah, sure, crooks." He uses his name rather than an insulting term. Okay, so I think I've dealt with the way that Candy's interaction with and representation of other characters is interesting. Okay, now I'm trying to bring it back to looking at Candy's old age and his disability. And actually, I'm thinking at the moment I haven't said anything about his dog yet. And chapter 3 is probably the main chapter. Section 3 is the main section that really focuses on Candy. And of course, the shooting of his dog is central to that, isn't it? So I need to bring myself round to what is probably the most significant moment in the novel in relation to Candy. Otherwise, I'm going to run out of time before I've dealt with that. Okay. Candy's old age and disability cause him to be one of the most vulnerable characters on the ranch. Another way Steinbeck highlights this is by drawing parallels between him and his dog. Both are old and less physically able than they used to be. Candy appears desperate to hold on to him rather than let Carlson shoot him when he says, "Oh, I had him so long. You wouldn't think to look at him now, but he was the best damn sheepdog I ever seen." He could be seen as a reminder of the status that Candy once had, a trophy reminding him of past achievements or successes. So when he loses the dog, he could be seen to be losing recognition in others' eyes of the man he used to be. He also, of course, loses a companion, a sense of purpose, and something that marks him out as different. In a world in which the migrant workers find it difficult to form long-term relationships because their lives are so transitory and they never have time to settle down anywhere, Candy, in his dog, has a permanent companion. He's about to lose that. So just like George, when he loses Lenny at the end of the novel, okay, of course, these two moments of the dog being shot and Lenny being shot are very much meant to be, one's meant to foreshadow the other. They're meant to be, parallel moments within the novel. So just like George, when he loses Lenny at the end of the novel, when Candy loses his dog, his life is reduced to the insignificant, monotonous, lonely life of any other migrant worker in Soledad, which is the Spanish for loneliness. Notice I'm just trying to do two things here. I'm trying to talk about migrant workers, okay, because that makes sure I'm bringing in some contextual stuff. I'm also thinking, let's just slip in the idea of Soledad meaning loneliness as well. I know I'm centering it on Candy here, but it's just an opportunity to bring in something else from elsewhere in the novel, isn't it? Okay, so I kind of think I've finished that paragraph, but I now feel there's more to be said, and so I want to just bring it back to Candy himself and how he's described a little more. And one of the main things that I think is so useful to talk about Candy is the adverbs that are used often to describe him, particularly just before the shooting of his dog. So I'm going to write about those. Steinbeck emphasizes Candy's vulnerability at this point through the repeated use of adverbs such as uncomfortably, softly, helplessly, and nervously in the moments before Carlson shoots his dog. The only apparently positive adverb used is proudly, but this, of course, is about his dog, the one thing that helps him to feel life has some purpose and gives him a sense of dignity. Candy's loss of dignity when Carlson shoots his dog is emphasized by the fact that Candy later says to George, I ought to have shot that dog myself, George. I shouldn't have let no stranger shoot my dog. So there's a sense that once he joins in with the dream on George and Lenny, there's this sense of his dignity being restored, and he recognizes that he should have taken that responsibility himself for shooting his dog. It was only because he felt so small and insignificant and crushed by the possibility of losing his dog that he kind of just felt powerless to do anything and just lay on his bed in utter despair, didn't he? He says this once his dignity has been restored, as George allows him to join with him and Lenny in their quest to acquire a house and some land. Candy's increased confidence at this point is perhaps also evident in him joining the attack with joy when Curly is publicly humiliated prior to the fight with Lenny. So, I don't know if you remember, but there's this bit at the end of chapter 3, isn't there, where Slim has brushed off Curly, hasn't he? And Carlson has humiliated him as well. And then Candy joins in, one of the weakest people on the ranch, joins us in and says, a glove full of Vaseline. And it says he joined the attack with joy. And what I've said here is that Candy asserts himself here at this moment. He feels confident enough to say something like that in public. The other moment that I've said here that Candy asserts himself is in chapter 4 in Crooks's room when Curly's wife attempts to squash him, Lenny and Crooks. And she says, Saturday night, everybody out doing something. What am I doing? Standing here talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs. She uses the N-word, then she says, and a dum-dum and a lousy old sheep. So she's using very, very derogatory language to abuse them on the grounds of their status as migrant workers. So she talks about them as bindle stiffs, doesn't she? That means that they're homeless travellers, basically. Okay, and learning difficulties and race, and of course in Candy's case, his age. Okay, she's feeling very insecure because apart from anything else, she recognises that her husband has gone into town to a brothel for the evening. So her insecurity is understandable, but she nevertheless treats them very, very harshly, doesn't she? Candy resents her move in this jostling for power, and that's kind of what's happening, isn't it, in chapter 4? There's this jostling for power between the 4 weakest members of the ranch. So I put Candy resents her move in this jostling for power amongst the 4 weakest members of the ranch by physically and metaphorically standing up to her. Steinbeck uses physical movement a lot in the novel. Okay, people standing or sitting or standing in a doorway or rolling over. There's a lot to do with, or being bent down, rubbing their back. There's a lot to do with physical movement and positioning. It's a very visual, kind of dramatic novel. I don't mean dramatic as in sensational. I mean dramatic as in like a piece of drama. And so he uses the positioning of characters quite a lot. So here I put that he physically and metaphorically stands up to her. It says, he stood up suddenly and knocked his nail keg over backward. He then seeks to put her in her place on the grounds of gender, using the word floozy to refer to her, which could imply perhaps both her supposed promiscuity as well as the triviality of her thoughts. He treats her as a child when he says she should go along and roll her hoop, and uses her fear of her husband by suggesting that Curly maybe ain't going to like his wife out in the barn. So again, you might think, oh, am I steering too far away here? Well, I'm not, because I'm talking about how Candy treats another character and why that's important. Well, I think it's important because once again, his misogynistic attitudes are once again apparent here. It is worth noting that Steinbeck rarely portrays any character in a simplistic light in the novel. No character is completely worthy of our sympathy and flawless, and Candy is no exception. I could see how you could argue against that, but I kind of think the moment you start trying to look at any character in a simplistic light in Of Mice and Men, you'll actually find that there are more sides to them than you first thought. Okay, I'm coming towards, time-wise, I recognise I'm coming towards the end here, so I'm trying to think, okay, so how do I want to sum up Candy? But I don't want a waffly conclusion that's not going to say anything specific. Okay, I need to think, okay, what have I not mentioned so far? And there are lots of quotes that I'm thinking that I still want to include. So I'm kind of thinking, how can I use them to sum up some of the main things I want to say in terms of our overall reaction to Candy as readers? So I'll put this. Ultimately, though, Candy's dreams are for companionship and security in his old age. So when he pleads with George over Curly's wife's dead body, saying, "You and me can get that old place, can't we, George? You and me can go there and live nice, can't we, George? Can't we?" We plead with him. And his greatest fear is our greatest fear. Yeah, so I'm kind of saying we side with George, with Candy at that moment, don't we? We feel what he's feeling. Yeah, we wish we could, we want to say the same things to George that he's saying at that moment. Yeah, we're feeling the desperation that he's experiencing. And then I put, when Steinbeck presents us with a society in which no one reached out to comfort an old man whose dog has been shot, but instead sat there while he rolled slowly over and faced the wall and lay silent. We empathize and sympathize. Two reactions which seem rare in the harsh, largely heartless and ruthless world of the ranch of 1930s America. Yeah, we feel for him at that moment, don't we, when his dog is shot. So what I'm trying to do is say, actually, Steinbeck steers us towards siding with Candy and feeling things with Candy and experiencing his life and his dreams and his disappointments and his hopes and his fears. We experience all those things with him. When the dream is dead following the death of Curly's wife, we notice Steinbeck highlighting once more Candy's stump. He noticed every time Candy is represented as vulnerable and powerless, out comes the stump. Steinbeck shows that symbol to us once again. So he highlights Candy's stump when he writes, "His eyes blinded with tears, and he turned and went weakly out of the barn, and he rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump." Candy's initial position of desperation, think how desperate he is at the beginning of the novel, but certainly in chapter 3 when his dog gets shot. So this initial position of desperation has returned following the glimmer of hope. But in a world in which the best laid schemes and mice and men gang after gley, that was always going to be inevitable.